Uh, Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year and welcome back to the AI seminar series. As you can see, today we'll have Professor Krichmar as our speaker. In addition, I want to draw your attention to upcoming seminars in the next 3 weeks. I hope we can see you all for those talks. As I said, today our speaker is Professor Jeffrey Krichmar. He received his BSc from University of Massachusetts and at Amherst and the MS degree from George Washington University and PhD from George Mason University. After that, he spent 15 years in industrial companies, and later he joined academia in 1997, where he is currently a full professor at the University of California at Irvine, cross-appointed at the departments of cognitive sciences and computer science. His research area includes neurorobotics, embodied cognition, and biologically plausible models of learning and memory, and the effect of neural architecture on neural function. And today we are privileged to have his talk on neurorobotic design principles connecting the brain, body, and environment. If you have any question, you can use the chat box and Q&A box, and I'll read your questions during the meeting. And as usual, by the end of the talk, we'll have a time allocated for Q&A. And with that being said, I leave the stage to Dr. Krichmar.
Well, thank you, Mohammed, for the invitation and the nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about something called neurorobotics. You might not be familiar with this, but it's been driving my research for many years now. And over the years, we've come up with a set of design principles. And that's what I'm going to go through today with lots of examples of what a neurorobot can do and things to consider when you're trying to build this kind of system. And I guess before I get started, as Mohammed said, I'm in the departments of cognitive science and computer science at UC Irvine. My lab is called the Cognitive Anteater Robotics Lab. So a lot of our robots are named Carl is the acronym. And then towards the right, we've been, this work over the years has received generous funding from most recently from these agencies on the right. Okay, so sort of a shameless self-promotion, but we had a book just recently come out called Neurorobotics, Connecting the Brain, Body, and Environment. It was written by myself and Tiffany Hu, who is a former grad student, and she was the teaching assistant for the cognitive robotics class that we taught for many years, and I'm still teaching it. And so we decided that we wanted to update the material we were using. So we wrote a book largely over the pandemic, and then it just got published in November of last year. So really excited about that. So I do want to talk about some of the key points from the book. And I'm also excited because now I'm using it for the first time in my class that I teach robotics. And that's Tiffany, obviously, on the right. Okay, so what is neurorobotics and what's the approach? And as the title said, it's a holistic approach that combines the brain, body, and behavior. So I'm a computational neuroscientist, but I've been thinking over the years and working with people that really drive home the point that the brain is useless without a body, and that body is important. Brain and body is important for actually generating behavior. And then when you generate behavior, it affects the environment, and that affects the design of the agent. So it's this whole idea of embodiment. And neurorobotics relies on that. and starts to use, the robot as a surrogate body. It has sensors and actuators, and it does actually force you to consider the limits of, the noisy inputs and outputs that don't always do what you expect them to do. And doing this compared to simulations, and I do some simulation work, and the simulation environments have gotten much better, but still putting a robot in the real world reduces potential biases. Real worlds are complex, they're noisy, they're uncertain, come with uncertainty. And unlike, a lot of benchmarks which use games, there's no rules in the real world. So I think this is a more rigorous and realistic test of algorithms. What do we use it for? So there's two reasons. Once you have this, closed loop of the brain, body, and behavior with the environment, and you have a neural network model that is based on aspects of the brain and the nervous system, then you can actually test it in a real world environment in ways that are difficult to do in laboratory with animal models. You can have access to every aspect of the artificial nervous system and perturb it in ways that'd be really difficult or impossible with current recording technology. And then you can take it out of the lab. So I'll show you examples where you'll see robots that are sort of replicating a laboratory experiment that someone did with an animal, and then taking a robot and putting it out in the real world, in the wild, and seeing how these brain functions actually work in real world conditions. So that's one approach. It's a nice tool for understanding how the brain works. Another reason to do this is it might make a better autonomous system, intelligent system, because we're following the biological intelligence. And we can talk about how AI, I do a lot of work in AI, and but I think we'd all agree at some point AI falls short of what a biological organism can do. And so this provides a working model toward making more intelligent systems. So it's a twofold approach, and I'm always straddling, am I going to do this more application-based, or am I going to do this more computational neuroscience to make predictions about the brain? And they go hand in hand. So what are some of the current research areas? It's just all over. There's a lot of work because we have active sensors in perception. Not just mine, I mean, there's a community, so not just my work, but of all the senses, there's different neurorobotic models. There's a lot of models. I don't do too much of this, but with locomotion, I will show you some robots that are kind of more natural locomotion than other robotic systems. We do a lot of work in memory and navigation, do a lot of work in neuromodulation and attention. I will show you a little bit, but there's a whole group of people doing human-robot interaction and social interaction using the robots to do that. And then in the middle, there's neuromorphics. I'll talk a little bit about that, but there are new architectures of computer architectures that are more brain-based, and they kind of leverage the idea of how the brain is so efficient. And we'll talk about that as we go forward today. Okay. So let me just give you an example, an oldie but a goodie. So this is about when I jumped into the field of neurorobotics. It wasn't called neurorobotics then. I was working with Gerald Edelman and his group on the Darwin series of brain-based devices. And this is Darwin 7 back in the day. And it has a camera so it can see, it has microphones so it can hear, and it goes around and finds these play blocks which have different patterns, and it has different tones coming out of the play blocks. And similar to the brain, we have a nervous system with an auditory stream that gets early processing and then builds up features. and a visual stream that gets information off the camera, builds up the features like primary visual cortex, and then classifications like inferotemporal temporal cortex. And it has taste. So the stripe blocks were arbitrarily made to be conductive, and the spotty or blob blocks were made to be weakly conductive. And its taste buds were in its gripper. And so if it was supposed to learn that a block with a certain visual and auditory feature was good tasting, and one with different auditory and visual features that's weakly conductive were bad tasting. So it's kind of a conditioning experiment where the unconditioned stimulus is the taste and the conditioned stimulus is the visual and auditory pattern. And similar to experimental psychology, we see these learning curves where it starts to do the condition response very almost close to perfect. And let me just show you a video of this. This is before learning, and this is examining its artificial brain. So this is its early visual system, and it's retinotopically organized. So what you see is what you get. This is its higher order visual area, IT, and it will start to do a self-organizing map to make classification activities for different patterns. And over here is its action. So if there's activity on the left, that means it's bad tasting. If there's activity on the right, it would be good tasting. So if I run this video, this is the first time it's seen a stripe block. It's got a weak pattern in IT, picks it up, pattern's getting stronger, it's learning, it's good tasting, puts it down. Here's the first time it sees a blob block, which is bad tasting, but it doesn't know that yet. See the activity on the left side, this motor area, and so it's bad tasting, building up a category for that. So after, similar to an animal experiment, about 8 to 10 pairings, it's learned this association, and before I run this, it visually sees this pattern. It's got a strong pattern in this area IT, and it's enough to drive the prediction that this will be good tasting. So it's become predictive. And also, importantly, you see this object is oriented in a different direction than when it's in its gripper. It's not the same size, it's not the same position, so it actually builds up invariant object recognition. And that's just because it's seeing the world like we do, as a constant stream of information rather than individual exemplars. And let me run this. So it knows it's good. It's going to pick it up and enjoy a tasty stripe block. And now here's a bad tasting block. It does go up to it, but it's looking at it, knows it's going to taste bad, backs away without picking it up. So that's a nice example of what we call machine psychology, but it also shows you the whole kind of neurorobotic approach where we built an artificial nervous system. It was based on how the brain works. We analyzed it, in all ways we could, looking at every single neuron, every single synapse. And we tied it very closely to behavior and follow that behavior through the lifetime of this robot's life. Okay. So let's get into some of the design principles. I mean, that was over 20 years ago. Good God. Anyway, and it's sort of what lessons we've learned and how we put this together. Before I get into the neurorobotic lessons, they really are built on work by Rolf Pfeifer and Josh Bongard, who had a lovely book. I used to teach out of it called How the Body Shapes the Way We Think. And they really were emphasizing that embodied physical agents are the only way you can get intelligence. And I won't go through their design principles, but we really did follow this. But one of the reasons we wrote our book is because when we were teaching it, we're in the cognitive sciences department. We really wanted to emphasize also the cognitive science and neuroscience and add to that, which they, for reasons of what their point was, they didn't really emphasize that. So that leads me to our design principles. So there are 3 levels, and I'll go through them. Time permitting, I might have to rush through some of the last ones, but the 3 levels are, first, there's reactive. So you respond to the here and now, and I'll go through some of these. There's adapting in some plasticity, but it's very short term. Intermediately, there's a long-term learning and memory, so adaptive behavior. And we'll go through some of those and what I mean by that. And then, interestingly, there's a whole bunch of trade-offs that go with any organism, us or any organism that's trying to live, that you have to trade off and make decisions and decide one thing versus another. And they're important for survival. And what's really interesting to me from a neuroscience standpoint is many of these are driven by brain chemicals. And we'll go into that a little bit too. So first, let's start with the here and now and some of the ideas from that. So one idea is embodiment and efficiency through cheap design. And so what that means is that the body, its shape, its morphology can do a lot of the heavy lifting and offload the brain. And it makes sense because our brains are really slow. Neurons firing rapidly is 100 times per second. And this example on the left was a robotic soccer team I was on using a Segway, and we were trying to capture a soccer ball. And with a 30 frame per second camera, it was near impossible. And so after much struggling with the vision system, we put on this plastic hula hoop around the robot. And then, typically just like us, the body traps the ball. Then the robot feels the ball and then is able to orient and then look at it and decide this is a ball I'll either shoot or pass. And that just really drove home the point, like, this is example of morphological computation or efficiency through cheap design. More to our day-to-day life, if you look at bipedal locomotion, some of those robots out there, there's Asimo, which was recently retired, I heard, but you also, some of the stuff from Boston Dynamics probably takes a lot of energy. Whereas when we walk, we don't, because we're actually exploiting the environment, the physics. So we're actually pushing off using friction and then falling down using gravity. So there's a lot of passive dynamics in our walking. And this tripod walker from Cornell went for, I forget how many kilometers on a small battery charge, and was using around the energy consumed that a person would use walking. So that's another example of this efficiency through cheap design. So you should consider that when you're making your robot, have the body do a lot of the heavy lifting. The brain is also a beautiful example of cheap design. We're under extreme metabolic constraints, and amazingly, the brain operates on a mere 20 watts of power. The same amount of power required for a ceiling fan to operate at low speed. How does it do it? Well, the brain codes information efficiently by have sparse coding. It does dimensionality reduction, and it's event-driven. So one of the reasons I think neurons in the brain spike is because it doesn't take much energy. You have to have energy when you have an action potential, and then when that action potential is received at a downstream neuron, then you have to take some energy to actually process that. But in between those spikes, you're not using much energy at all. And this idea is not lost on hardware engineers. And that's where neuromorphics comes in. So they mimic the brain's design. They make computers that are event-driven, that are spiking. And Here's some examples. Spinnaker from Manchester. There's on here the Intel Loihi chip. There's the neuromorphic vision sensor that came out of Toby Delbrook's group. And then over here is the IBM True North. And we worked with IBM. These are IBM engineers. That's Tiffany. And Tiffany made a neural network, a convolutional neural network, converted it to spiking, and ported it to the IBM True North chip. Actually, this is the first time the True North chip was actually used in a closed loop. So we were kind of worried. And this is at Telluride, Colorado. And so this was the first time we actually tested it. And it's going up it's much steeper than it looks, a mountain trail, and staying on the trail. And there's a 200-foot drop off to the left, which is why Tiffany is monitoring that rope to make sure they're, millions of dollars of research and development don't go falling down the mountain. But anyway, the point that drove it home was not the neural net itself, but we ran this robot for at least an hour up and down these trails. And the robot was a small RC car kind of robot with a nickel metal hydride battery. And that battery powered the robot and their chips over that whole period of time without losing complete charge. So that, I think from a robotics standpoint, this actually could be a really great avenue for having systems that can run far away from power sources over long periods of time. But it also drives home the point of the efficient design of the brain. Another important aspect of neurorobotics and neuroscience is sensory motor integration. I teach a neuroscience class to both undergraduates and graduates, and I use a really good textbook, but just the way I teach it, just like the textbook goes, we separate the sensory systems, the vision system, the auditory system, et cetera, from the motor systems. But that's not realistic. What this chart is showing on the left is after you get through primary sensory, like vision, touch, auditory, shortly after that, there's a mix between, and here's the primary motor. After that, there's a mix of both information, of both sensory and motor information. And it's highly integrated. And it makes sense because if you take an action, it's going to generate new sensory input, which is going to generate a new action. And it actually can solve hard problems. So if you look on the right, this is an old robotics experiment, but I think it drives the point that here's a figure ground segregation issue. So you're trying, on this table, there's a block, and it's a hard computer vision problem to figure out where the block is and where the ground is. But with this robot kind of flailing around, once it hits the block, it actually changes the expectation of the sensory information, and then it immediately solves the figure ground segregation problem because this thing moves, it was unexpected, and then that's separate, and you also feel it. So that's an example of how sensory motor integration can solve different difficult problems if you don't separate them. Another idea that comes out of all of biology is what's known as degeneracy. So you have different elements perform the same function or the same output. It's a little different than redundancy, where you have exact copies. And you see this throughout biology, not just the nervous system. The genetic code is an example of degeneracy, where there's 3 amino acids that encode protein. I'm sorry, 3 base pairs that encode an amino acid, but there's only 18 amino acids and 64 possible combinations. So that's an idea of degeneracy. But we have degeneracy with the way we move. There's all sorts of different ways, the way that we can generate the same output by different movements. Same with communication. And what about neuroscience? So here's an example of a robot Neurorobot experiment that we did, where it's solving a dry version of what's known as the Morris water maze. So it's trying to find a hidden platform in this room. And the platform is over here on the right. It's the same color as the floor, so it can't see it, but if it lands on it, it can feel it. So it's similar to this gold standard test of hippocampal processing called the Morris water maze, where the rat has to swim. So here's about 8 trials into it, and it's learned goal-directed behavior. It somehow bypasses the spot, but then bounces off the blue wall and finds the spot. Now, what was interesting when I ran this experiment, that really bothered me. But then I realized that this actually made sense. So we ran this, again, almost 10 times with slightly different nervous systems on the same robot, and we got different solutions. This one learned that bouncing off the blue wall was a good solution. Some of them bounced off the red wall. Some went directly to the platform. So behaviorally, it solved this in multiple ways. So that's degeneracy. We also looked at its brain. And so in the hippocampus, there are cells that fire when you're in a place. They're called place cells. It's like the brain's GPS. And this is a place cell that fires going in a certain place from a certain direction. And this is several time steps before this place cell fired. And you see this pattern of activity that led to it. You don't have to worry about what those dots are, but they're all different parts of its artificial brain. And here's another example of the same place cell and going the same direction, but a whole different set of neurons caused that to fire. So that's degeneracy too. And so you can imagine this gives you flexibility and fault tolerance. Another important aspect of how we process things, which is very different from the old classic, good old-fashioned AI, which was sense, think, and act. We're really multitaskers, and we're driven by events. This was really made clear a long time ago by Rodney Brooks with his subsumption architecture. And around this time, people from Sheffield, Tony Prescott's group, we're also looking at the brain and saying, hey, the brain also is similar to the subsumption, where you have different different parts of the brain that can interrupt others when some event happens. That's important, so that you're not constantly like slowly sensing, thinking over, and acting. You're monitoring all your signals, and then if an important signal comes in, you can sort of interrupt the other processes and make sure yours happens. And an area of the brain that does this is called the basal ganglia. So this is a rodent experiment called the open field. And when you put a rat in an open area, it'll stay towards the walls, just like this robot's doing. But once it becomes comfortable with the walls, its fear is down, and it might be hungry. And so in the robot's case, it gets over its hunger by picking up these cylinders and taking it to the edge. So there's a whole bunch of behavioral repertoires here between wall following, finding a cylinder, picking up the cylinder, placing the cylinder. And they made a model of this area of the brain called the basal ganglia, which is like the ultimate action selection system, where it's in parallel monitoring all these signals and then deciding which action is the most important given its fear or hunger level, and then having that action take over and inhibit all the other actions. So it was a really nice demonstration of multitasking, event-driven processing that can be realized in a neurorobot and really drives home a lesson about how this area called the basal ganglia works. Okay, so that's the first level of design principles. Now let's talk a little bit about adaptive behavior. And it's important to remember, learn something, but to remember what's learned and then be able to apply it. in the future. And a key driver of learning is your motivation, which I call value systems. And then another key is to be able to predict future events. And so those are the three things. Being able to predict future events, you have to build up sort of a memory and expectations, but you also have the ability when something doesn't meet your expectations to adapt and adjust. So the value systems, it's signals often what is good or bad, reward or punishment, but it also can just be in general interesting. And here's where some of the neuromodulators come into play. So things like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine drive different values. Like dopamine is often thought of for reward. We'll talk more about dopamine can do other things. Serotonin is often thought about as cost. Norepinephrine can be important for surprise, and acetylcholine can be important for attentional effort. And there's two phases to these. Sometimes they are just kind of tonically setting a level of how much you monitor these values. Sometimes there's a phasic response that causes you to stop what you're doing, be decisive because some new signal came in that I have to respond to. So here's an example of it. This is one of our first robots when we came to UC Irvine, the original Carl, and it learned that green was good and blue is bad. So notice when the panel turns red, this serotonin system came on very rapidly and phasically, and now it turned green, and now it's predictive of good, and it came on very rapidly and phasically. And what it had was a strong attentional effect. So it really boosted up the signal to noise ratio. So this is the phasic response. So all other colors are ignored. Cyan, magenta, red are all ignored while it's looking at the green, because that's really salient. But watch when this turns some neutral color, like now it turns magenta. It's hard to see with the colors, but now you see that sort of light blue. That means everything's tonically active, so it's actively exploring, but nothing is salient. So that shows you kind of the difference between a phasic neuromodulation and tonic neuromodulation and what they can do for signal to noise ratio and also adapting. Now, with all these values, and we're doing this in robotics, they're really artificial, and that always bothered me, and it's still an open issue. We have real pain, hunger, and thirst, and fatigue, and that's what drives us and motivates us. But what does that mean to a robot? So it's interesting to see how we could do that. Maybe charging batteries could be your energy level, but it takes a long time to charge batteries, which is the bane of roboticist existence. But maybe solar cells that could be really rapidly a charge could be another way. There's this work though that I thought gets close to it, by Cully, Murray, and Jeff Clune. And they made a walking robot, a hexapod robot, and then they damaged one of its legs. And the robot had an internal model of its body. And in its head, it mentally simulated a whole bunch of potential gaits with 5 legs now that it realized it was damaged. And then when it thought it had a potentially good gait, it would try that out. And then if it worked well, it would update its sort of behavior map. And after a few short trial and errors in mental simulation, the robot actually recovers from that injury and is able to walk on 5 legs pretty efficiently. So the question is, the robot did know something was wrong. It was able to adapt. So is that real value? Did it really feel the pain? Oh, and this is, if you have a robot, you have to do a slow motion video of it. So it's an open question, but I think it gets closer to something having real value. And then prediction. This is one of the hallmarks of cognitive behaviors, our ability to predict and plan. And in mammalian systems, and especially primates, much of the cortex is devoted to predicting and building up an internal model. And so neurorobots should attempt to have these capabilities. And This is work by June Tani's group. And their robot, they use a lot of recurrent neural nets. And their robots learn to predict, and they use hierarchies of recurrent neural nets. And the lower hierarchy is becomes more like a motor primitive, and the higher one becomes a more slow predictive system that can tweak the motor primitives. And so you see this robot is very nicely able to predict where this object is going. And then sometimes they try and fool it like now and do a different pattern. The robot immediately figures out, oh, that's a new pattern, and generates a new prediction. So that's just one of many nice examples of using robotics in a predictive control system. And then learning and memory. So one thing that I think is different about our brains and AI is our learning ability. We learn quickly, continuously, and incrementally. So we build on what we've learned. We learn something new with just a few presentations. We don't forget what we've learned before. We can transfer this learning and generalize and apply it from one situation to another. How does the brain do that? There's a theory called the complementary learning systems, that the hippocampus learns very rapidly. And then as it learns rapidly, it offloads a lot of these memories or consolidates them to other parts of the brain and the cortex. And so you have sort of an interleaved rapid learning with a gradual longer learning and consolidation. And this was proposed by Jay McClelland and Bruce McNaughton years ago, and updated by the DeepMind group with Jay McClelland. Now, one challenge to this is context or schemas. So if you're in a restaurant, like, this restaurant on the right is in Irvine. So I think I've probably been to this restaurant. So if you go to this restaurant, you're familiar with it, you know the menu, you know where you're going to sit and stuff. You might be outdoors because it's Southern California. And then you go to a restaurant on the left in Seattle, and you're not completely lost because you have a schema of what a restaurant is. You know that there's going to be waiters, there's going to be, and waitresses, there's going to be tables, there's going to be menus, there's going to be, food served and things like that. And so you can put this information and use it again, and you can rapidly consolidate this information. And this was shown as a challenge maybe to that complementary learning system, that if something fit within a context, you could rapidly put it into Cortex. And so this was the original experiment, one of the early experiments on this idea by Morris's group with Dorsey, and they had paired associations of places and odors, and you'd cue the animal here with an odor, and then it would learn to dig to get the food that goes with that odor in one of these spots. So this was, they call the schema or context. And then if you added like one or two new pair associations or deleted one or two of these, they found that you didn't need the hippocampus. So what they showed was, even after 2 days, if you didn't have a hippocampus and you had something that fit within a context, that you didn't need the hippocampus now to recall that. So that actually, I think, was an interesting idea of how we actually put things into context and maybe overcome problems like catastrophic forgetting. Let me skip this one, except to say that it was further found that there's interaction between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex that actually allows this to happen. And so we made a model, Tiffany Hugh and I, especially Tiffany, made a model of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, and modulating how familiar an object was and how novel. So if an object was unfamiliar and novel, that might mean you're in a new context or schema. But if you were in a familiar environment with a novel object, that might mean this is an existing schema and that you can add this object to your schema. And here's how the experiment went robotically. We would type in something like the word teddy bear, Then our robot would be looking around this room, kind of learning all it can about this room, but also looking for the teddy bear. And it takes a long time, but it's actually building up a lot of memory about this schema for this classroom. And it picks up the teddy bear and places it in the spot. A few trials later, ask it to get the teddy bear and goes immediately there. Now I put it in a new context, this break room where we keep a lot of food. And so the robot's looking for a cup, but it's also learning about this new room. And that's another schema. And eventually finds the cup. And a few trials later, goes right to the cup and is able to retrieve the cup. And then sometimes we put it back into the old room and it didn't forget anything about the old room. It was able to retrieve objects from the original schema in the classroom. Or we cue it with something it never picked up before. And the banana, it decided, well, banana is probably going to be in the break room on the table. And so it has a prediction there. And then it goes straight over to that spot in the room and picks up a banana. And so this nicely showed that it showed a few things, that it learned very rapidly these different schemas, and the blue line shows it started to get more correct in its responses, and the red line showed it took less and less time to retrieve an object. And then down here where you see CR, when we returned it to the original room it learned originally, it didn't have catastrophic forgetting because it separated these contexts. And also when we gave it, cued it with objects it had never seen before, it made accurate predictions that a book should be on the desk or the teacher's desk, or a food object should be on the table. So not only does this give you, some ideas and maybe the brain's way of overcoming catastrophic forgetting, doing lifelong learning or switching between tasks, it might have applications for caretaking, where you have a robot that has contextual awareness and knows about a household and what to do in different rooms and where different objects should be found. So there's some practical applications here that could be pulled from this kind of work. Okay, let's see how I'm doing on time. All right, we'll go very quickly through the trade-offs, and I can talk more about it, but I'll give another 5 minutes on the third part, the behavioral trade-offs, then we'll do some Q&A. So one thing I said earlier about these trade-offs, like reward versus punishment, but also are you invigorated versus withdrawn? Do you explore something or exploit something? Do you decide to, well, all of these are actually neuromodulator chemicals. So these are low-level areas of the brain that actually have strong signals across the whole brain, which actually can change context or can change which side of the trade-off you'll be on. And some of these down here are actually hormones that can affect, do you actually look for food, or do you sort of fight and defend your nest? Or are you going to be handling a stressor, or are you going to be calm? Or are you going to be a social being, or are you going to be a more solitary being? And I find this really interesting that these chemicals really are experimentally, we've seen that they can really drive which way you're going to be on these trade-offs. And just from a robotics standpoint, implementing these trade-offs can make them more relatable, more natural, more interesting. And just you think about any story, conflict makes for a good story. So let's look at one of these, or two of these actually. Reward versus punishment. For dopamine is known to trigger reward prediction errors or track reward prediction errors. Serotonin's kind of questionable. There's a lot of evidence that serotonin's kind of following your harm aversion or punishment. But at the same time, dopamine is important for, or drives invigoration. That's what cocaine does. And serotonin actually might cause inhibition. So when you're, in depression, you're kind of inhibited and withdrawn. So there's this, this was a nice review a few years ago by Bureau and Peter Diane, showing that there's this, opponency between these, but it's more complicated than just one dimension. So we wanted to look at that with a robot, and we made a model of these neuromodulators, and the dopamine would affect things that are invigorated, like exploring an environment, and the serotonin would drive things that are more withdrawn, like stick to the wall or find a nest. And we put this on a Roomba, and initially the Roomba is kind of scared. It's an unfamiliar environment, and it hugs the walls. And in the upper right corner, there's the Roomba's charging station. So now it's trying to find home. But before it gets to its charging station, enough time has passed that the dopamine system actually is driving strong curiosity and invigorated behavior. And so now it actually is looking at a novel object, kind of palpating the object with its touch sensor. And so it's in exploring the middle of the room. And this is just what you'd see in a mouse. You'd see this kind of behavior with a mouse or a rat. And it's actually a model experiment for anxiety and also invigorated activity. And this one's kind of complicated, but let's go to this one. When we ran the experiments, they were run completely in the dark. And then after about a minute where the robot was kind of settled, we would flash on the lights. And this would cause anxious behavior. It would cause the robot to rapidly go either to its charging station or stay on the walls. Till about a minute later, when this was the serotonin level be really high. And about a minute later, the serotonin level is kind of dropping down and the dopamine levels coming up. And then it starts to explore its environment and go in the middle and stay away from the walls, similar to what a rat would do. Now, what was interesting was we could lesion different parts of the brain so that the serotonin system was overactive, causing the robot to be completely withdrawn and depressed and hide in the corner. Or we could lesion areas that affect the dopamine system, causing the robot to now have an obsessive compulsive disorder and not have any fear and just constantly be going over and over back to what that was a novel object. So I think there's some really nice lessons here about the interplay between serotonin and dopamine, and also maybe some predictions for different neurological disorders. Okay, so this is probably a good time to wrap up. So let's just go to kind of my final thoughts. I think neurorobotics is a really powerful tool to understand the brain, but also maybe for artificial general intelligence and getting a little bit closer. And I've been doing this for a number of years, and so is my my co-author Tiffany Hu, and many people in my labs. From my Neuroscience Institute lab in San Diego when I worked with them, and then also the lab at UC Irvine. And we've come up with these principles. I don't follow all of them. I would like to. It's difficult, but I think if you start to follow these principles, you'll get more intelligent systems and you'll see more interesting behavior and get more lessons. So in general, I think this is a powerful tool for studying coupling between brain, body, and behavior. And following this could lead to a new class, intelligent robots and cognitive assistants. And I think it's a good place to stop. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you for your informative talk. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. So I have a quick question. Your talk primarily touched upon high-level expectations from AI. I wanted to know what is your perspective on how these types of behaviors can be incorporated into deep learning, which is more or less a low-level thing. Would that processing low-level features, how we can improve deep learning into a kind of processing behavior similar to what you described.
Oh, sure. That's actually a really good and deep question. So I'll start with a kind of, I guess, non-controversial, and then have a controversial, maybe controversial, maybe not. But you know, the ideas from neuromodulation have really found their way in a lot of deep learning systems. We were actually, you were too, Mohammed, part of the lifelong learning machines. We were doing neuromodulation models and adding that to deep learning systems to get better adaptive behavior, and so were other groups. We also were looking at, as were other groups, those memory systems. One thing about memory consolidation is when we are in quiet wake or sleeping, we replay episodes, and that can really boost learning, especially in reinforcement learning, deep reinforcement learning systems that have done that. So there's a lot of lessons that are finding their way in deep learning. I think one problem I have with a lot of the deep learning and a lot of the AI is they're in very simple simulated systems or using simple benchmarks and just trying to squeeze more out of it. It really ignores what makes us intelligent, is that we have bodies and we have needs and we have actions that we have to take. And so removing that, I think, kind of limits what we can do. So I think there's lessons there to do these things in more natural situations and try and do more things in the wild that have potential biases or gains with rules. So that's the more controversial one, is I'd like to see more of these things applied into more realistic situations and actually have real needs.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that we'll need to change to come up with more complex architectures, or just expanding current architectures will be enough?
Oh, that's another good question. I personally think the brain's anatomy has a lot of lessons, and the architecture of most of these deep learning systems do not really follow the anatomy. So the recurrent neural nets gets a little bit there, but there are streams, there's recurrence or reentrant connections, there's hierarchies, there's these broadcast signals like neuromodulation. There's a lot of connectivity motifs in the nervous system, and I think that's a limit of some of these kind of feed forward or completely recurrent neural nets that is ignoring a lot of the complexity. That being said, it's really hard to analyze these complex systems. Neuroscience has been doing it for centuries, and trying to build tools to figure out, the connectome. So, but I think what makes the brain, or what's the most important aspect of brains, is the anatomy, not the dynamics of the individual neurons or synapses. So I think more realistic architectures might actually be another way to push deep learning into doing new things.
Thank you. So it looks like we don't have many questions. Part of it, I guess, is because the audience are not very familiar with neuroscience, but it was an interesting perspective for people with only CS background. And thank you again for your talk. And I guess we can end this session.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you.